Oak. In the winter of 1887, five hardened trapper brothers sent their gold to a matrimonial agency in Toronto and asked for five separate women. What arrived on the frozen banks of the Fraser River was something no one had bargained for. Four sisters and their widowed mother, carrying love in one hand and a secret that could get them all killed in the other. Oak. The Brannock brothers had survived 14 winters in the British Columbia interior on stubbornness alone. Their father had staked a claim in the mountains north of Kamloops in 1871, built a cabin large enough to shame a barn, and died of a fever before he ever saw it finished. His five sons had finished it without complaint. They were not men given to sentiment, but they were men who understood the arithmetic of survival. Oak. 5 men on a mountain, aging through their 30s without a woman's voice in the house, was a slow kind of dying. Oak. It was Fletcher Brannock, the eldest, who put the idea into words at the supper table one February night. The wind was shrieking off the peaks, hard enough to rattle the shutters, and the 5 of them were hunched over bowls of salted moose stew, the silence between them the kind that had calcified over years into something neither comfortable nor hostile, simply permanent. Fletcher set down his spoon, looked at each of his brothers in turn, and said flatly that they needed wives. Oak. Dougal, the second eldest, whose left hand was missing 2 fingers from a trapping accident, and who had not spoken of his loneliness to another living soul in a decade, said nothing, but he nodded. Oak. Crispin, third born and the sharpest mind of the 5, who kept a shelf of law books and surveyor's manuals above his bunk, and who had once talked a fur buyer down from a swindle without raising his voice, folded his arms and asked what kind of woman would consent to come this far north in winter. Oak. Reeve the fourth, a quiet giant who communicated primarily in single syllables, and whose gentleness with injured animals bordered on the supernatural, simply looked at his bowl. Oak. And the youngest Aldous. No, that name was taken. The youngest was named Perth. Perth Brannock, 26 years old, who read poetry in secret and carved wooden figures by lamplight and felt the loneliness of the mountain more keenly than any of his brothers, pushed his stew away and said he thought it was a fine idea. Oak. Fletcher wrote 5 letters to the Crown and Covenant Matrimonial Agency in Toronto. He was methodical about it. For himself, he asked for a woman of practical temper, unbothered by rough conditions, capable of hard decisions. For Dougal, he asked for a woman who did not startle easily and who understood that silence was not the same as coldness. For Crispin, he requested someone with an educated mind, a reader, a woman with opinions she wasn't afraid to voice. Oak. For Reeve, he asked for a woman with patience and gentleness, someone who would not try to change a man who was already whole. For Perth, he asked simply for a woman with a kind heart and courage enough to match it. Oak. The agency wrote back in April, promising 5 women from different circumstances. A widow named Mrs. Ashby, a seamstress named Miss Holt, a schoolteacher named Miss Vance, a bookkeeper named Miss Corwin, and a young woman of good family named Miss Pelham. Oak. 5 separate names, 5 separate histories, 5 strangers. Oak. The brothers rode down from the mountain on a Thursday in late May, when the snowmelt had turned the lower trail into something a horse could manage without praying. They came into the settlement of Clearwater looking like what they were. 5 enormous men in fur and leather, armed to the teeth, squinting against the unfamiliar brightness of a town with more than 6 buildings. The riverboat from Kamloops was already docked. Oak. A crowd had gathered on the bank, curious in the way that frontier settlements were always curious about anything that broke the routine of surviving. Oak. The gangplank was lowered. Fletcher stood with his arms crossed, watching. Oak. The first woman to step off the boat was tall, with dark copper hair pinned beneath a practical wool hat and eyes the shade of river ice, pale, clear, and entirely unyielding. She moved with the bearing of someone accustomed to being in charge of a room. She was perhaps 30, and she carried a worn leather satchel over one shoulder and a sleeping infant against the other. This was supposedly Mrs. Ashby, the widow. Oak. Behind her came a second woman, shorter, with the same copper hair and the same pale eyes, though hers were scanning the crowd with the quick, methodical attention of someone cataloging exits. She was perhaps 27, Miss Holt, the seamstress. Oak. Then the third, and Fletcher felt something shift in the air around his brothers before he could name why. She came down the gangplank at a pace that suggested the boat was already boring her. Her copper hair loose and wind-tangled, a carpetbag swinging from her fist like she was ready to use it as a weapon if pressed. Miss Vance, the schoolteacher. Oak. The fourth woman descended carefully, one hand gripping the rope rail, her expression composed and deliberate. She was perhaps 22, the same copper hair braided neatly, the same pale eyes, though hers held something quieter than the others, something that had not yet decided whether or not it was afraid. Miss Corwin, the bookkeeper. Oak. And finally, the fifth, the youngest. She came last because she had been helping an elderly man with his luggage and had not thought twice about the delay. She couldn't have been more than 19. Her copper hair was escaping from beneath her hat in every direction. Her pale eyes found Perth Brannock's face across the dock as though she had been looking for him specifically, and she offered a small, uncertain smile that did something irreversible to the youngest Brannock's composure. Oak. Miss Pelham. Oak. Fletcher did not believe in coincidence. He had been a trapper long enough to know that when 5 tracks in the snow ran parallel, they came from the same animal. He looked at the 5 women standing shoulder to shoulder on the dock, same hair, same eyes, same subtle set of the jaw when they were being scrutinized, and he understood. Oak. He stepped forward. Oak. You're not strangers to each other, he said. It was not a question. Oak. The first woman, the one with the infant and the satchel, met his gaze without flinching. Oak. No, she said. My name is Lenora. This is my daughter May, and these are my daughters, Harriet, Josepha, Dora, and Wren. She indicated each in turn. I am their mother. Oak. A silence swept through the 5 brothers like a cold draft under a door. Oak. Crispin was the first to speak. You sent 5 applications to the same agency. Oak. We bribed the clerk, said Harriet, the seamstress, her chin lifting slightly. We needed to arrive at the same address. Oak. You lied, Fletcher said. Oak. We did what we had to do, said the schoolteacher. Josepha, stepping up beside her mother, her carpet bag still swinging. If you want to put us back on the boat, you are welcome to try. But I would not recommend it. Oak. Fletcher looked at his brothers. Dougal was staring at Harriet, who had not yet looked directly at his injured hand. Crispin was looking at Josepha with an expression he probably thought was neutral. Reeve had drifted, almost without appearing to move, to stand a little closer to Dora, who had gone very still in the manner of someone trying not to show they were frightened. Oak. And Perth was looking at the youngest Wren, who was still wearing that small, uncertain smile, and he looked like a man who had just read the last line of a poem and found it was better than he had any right to expect. Oak. Load the trunks, Fletcher said. Oak. The wagon ride north took the better part of a day and a half. The trail through the mountains was not a road in any civilized sense. It was a decision made repeatedly in the face of terrain that suggested strongly that no one should be here. The sisters communicated in the language of shared looks and hands that reached across wagon boards to grip each other at the worst corners. Oak. Lenora sat in the front with her granddaughter May tucked against her chest, her eyes on the mountain above them, saying nothing. Oak. Fletcher drove. He was aware of Lenora's presence beside him the way a man is aware of weather. Something large and undeniable that required his attention. She didn't speak until the trail leveled out onto the first of the high plateaus, where a hawk was riding the thermals far above, and the Fraser River was a silver thread in the valley below. Oak. You didn't send us back, she said. Oak. No, Fletcher said. Oak. You could have. Oak. Could have done a lot of things. Oak. She was quiet again, then. The contracts are binding regardless, you know that. We signed them in good faith even if we concealed our connection. Oak. I know, Fletcher said. Oak. Then why bring us up the mountain if you're angry about the deception? Oak. Fletcher kept his eyes on the horses. Didn't say I was angry, he said. Said you lied. Those aren't the same thing. Oak. Lenora looked at him then, and something in her expression shifted, fractionally, barely visible. But Fletcher had spent his life reading landscapes for the small signs that preceded large events. He thought she might be deciding whether to trust him. He thought she might have more practice than most at deciding wrong. Oak. That evening, around the supper table in the cavernous Brannock cabin, the connections between the couples had already begun their quiet, unreasonable work. Dougal sat across from Harriet and ate his meal in his characteristic silence, and Harriet, rather than filling the quiet with chatter the way most people did when faced with it, simply ate her supper and read the room with those quick cataloging eyes. Oak. At one point, Dougal reached across the table for the salt, and Harriet saw his hand. The 2 absent fingers, the rough scar tissue where they had been. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away with that particular studied neutrality people deployed when they were trying to be polite about staring. She simply looked at his hand the way she looked at everything, and then she looked up at him, and something passed between them that neither one of them had the language for yet. Okay. Crispin and Josepha had been arguing since somewhere around the second mountain pass. She had opinions about land survey law that were substantially better informed than he had expected, and she expressed them without apology, which Crispin found simultaneously irritating and galvanizing. By supper, they had moved from survey law to fur trading tariffs to the question of whether the Canadian Pacific Railway's terms were equitable to the communities it displaced, and Fletcher, watching from the head of the table, thought his brother looked more alive than he had in years. Reeve had said nothing to Dora, which under most circumstances would have been alarming, except that Dora had not required him to speak. She had found the cat that lived in the barn and was sitting with it in her lap, and Reeve had drifted over and sat down on the bench beside her, and they had simply been together with the cat and the fire for an hour, without it being strange. When supper was called, Reeve stood and offered her his hand to help her up, and she took it without hesitation, and he held it for exactly 1 second longer than necessary before letting go. Perth and Wren washed the dishes side by side which had not been assigned. It simply happened. Wren handed him the bowls one by one and he dried them, and she told him about the boat journey from Toronto, the way Lake Superior looked in the rain, the man 3 cabins down who played the fiddle every evening and didn't know when to stop. And Perth laughed at the right moments and asked questions at the right moments, and felt, for the first time in a long time, that the mountain was not particularly lonely after all. After supper, Fletcher asked Lenora to stay. The others filed into the side rooms. Harriet looked back once at her mother, and Lenora gave her a small, composed nod. "I'm fine. Go." When the doors closed, Fletcher set 2 mugs of spruce tea on the table and sat down across from her. "You didn't come up this mountain to find husbands," he said. Lenora curled both hands around the mug. She was quiet for a long moment, not evasive, but marshalling. "My daughters needed husbands who were a long way from Toronto," she said, "and from a man named Edmund Greer." Fletcher said nothing. He waited. He was good at waiting. Lenora looked at the fire. "My husband, Gerald, was a merchant shipper on Lake Ontario. A good man and a careful one, but he made one bad arrangement in his last year. He took a loan from Edmund Greer to expand his fleet. Greer is not a banker. He is him who lends money to acquire what money cannot otherwise buy." She looked up. When Gerald died and the debt passed to the estate, Greer came to the house not with lawyers but with a proposition. He wanted my daughters, not one of them. All of them. As household staff, he said, though the terms made plain that staff was not the word he meant. Fletcher's jaw set. "I refused him," Lenora continued. 2 nights later, a fire was set in our warehouse. We lost everything that remained of Gerald's business. Greer's man came to the house the following morning to tell me the fire was a demonstration, and that the next demonstration would not be a building. She set down the mug. "I had 1 week. "You ran," Fletcher said. "I ran," Lenora agreed, and there was no shame in her voice, only the flat precision of someone stating a fact they had already made their peace with. "I took my daughters, what jewelry we could carry, and every document Gerald had ever kept about his dealings with Greer, and we paid a clerk at the Crown and Covenant Agency to hide 5 applications in an outgoing manifesto to British Columbia under different surnames. We changed our names for the journey. We did not stop moving until we were on this boat." "Greer," Fletcher said, "he's got reach?" "He has money which buys reach," Lenora said. "He has influence in the courts and the police commission. He has a particular fondness for making problems disappear before they can become public knowledge." She met Fletcher's eyes. "He will not let this go. He will send men west. He may already have sent them. I have brought danger to your door, Mr. Brannock, and I will not insult you by pretending otherwise." Fletcher looked at his hands for a moment. He looked at the fire. He looked at the closed doors behind which his brothers were living, for the first time in years, in a house that felt inhabited rather than merely occupied. "This is Brannock land," Fletcher said quietly, in the voice that his brothers knew meant the matter was closed. "Nobody comes onto Brannock land and takes what's ours. You and your daughters are Brannock women now. That means you're ours to protect, and we are very, very good at protecting what's ours." Lenora stared at him. For a fraction of a second, the composure that she had worn like armor for the last 3 weeks cracked, and Fletcher saw what was underneath it. Not weakness, but an exhaustion so deep it had its own kind of gravity. Then she straightened. "Then we'd better be ready," she said. "Ok." The weeks that followed transformed the Brannock homestead into something between a household and a garrison. Fletcher reorganized the watch schedule, added reinforced bars to the window shutters, and set trip lines in the approaches from the lower trail. He taught Lenora to shoot a rifle with the same blunt efficiency with which he did everything, and she proved what Fletcher had suspected. She was not a woman who needed to be taught twice. Ok. Dougal built Harriet a sewing table by the south window without being asked. She came downstairs one morning to find it there. Finished in the night, the wood planed to smoothness and oiled. She ran her hands over it and said nothing for a moment. Then she said quietly that it was the finest piece of furniture she had seen since her father's house. Dougal's scarred hand tightened briefly on the doorframe, and he said it was just scrap pine, oak. She looked at him with those cataloging eyes and told him that she was a seamstress, and she knew quality workmanship when she saw it, and he should not pretend otherwise. He didn't argue. After that, he stopped sitting in the dark corners. Ok. Crispin and Josepha's arguments had evolved from debates into something more like collaboration. She had taken one look at the brothers' land claim documentation and identified 3 discrepancies that, if pursued by a hostile party, could potentially be used to challenge their tenure. She spent 2 evenings rewriting the filings. Ok. Crispin sat beside her, asked questions, and disagreed with her proposed wording on 2 points, and she told him he was wrong about one of them and right about the other, and he found this more satisfying than he could reasonably explain. He started leaving books on the corner of her table, not recommending them, just leaving them where she might find them. She read every one. Ok. Reeve had begun taking Dora on his daily checks of the trap lines, which was not a romantic gesture in any conventional sense, but was, for Reeve, an act of profound trust. He didn't explain the landscape, he let it explain itself. Dora was a quick study. Ok. She could read the signs of old snow and fresh track, and she didn't need to fill the mountain silence with conversation, and Reeve, who had lived his entire adult life in the company of men who mistook silence for emptiness, found her presence on the trail to be the most comfortable thing he could remember. Ok. Perth had started leaving his carvings out. For years, the figures he made by lamplight had gone straight into a box under his bunk, half from shyness and half from the certainty that none of his brothers would understand why a grown man spent his evenings making small wooden birds. One evening, Wren found the box. Ok. She sat down on the floor beside it and lifted each figure one by one, with a care that made Perth's throat tighten, and she asked him about each one. What wood, what occasion, what he had been thinking about. He told her. He had never told anyone. By the time supper was called, there were a dozen small wooden figures lined along the windowsill where the evening light hit them, and neither of them had discussed whether they would stay there. They stayed there. Ok. The warning came on a Wednesday in the form of a rider from the settlement at McClure, a Métis trapper named Beaumont, who had known the Brannocks for a decade, and who owed Fletcher a debt that went back to a bad winter and a leg injury, and a man who had refused to leave him in the cold. Beaumont arrived before dawn, his horse blown out, his face creased with urgency. Ok. 3 men had ridden into Clearwater the previous afternoon, he said. Easterners, badly dressed for the mountain weather, carrying significantly more firepower than tourists. They'd been asking at the trading post about 5 women, a mother and her daughters, all with copper hair. They'd shown money. They'd made threats wrapped in the language of legal authority, claiming to be agents working under a duly licensed collections mandate from the province of Ontario. Ok. Who's running them? Fletcher asked. Ok. Beaumont said the name he'd heard in the trading post was Mordecai Finch. Fletcher looked at Crispin, who had gone very still. Ok. Finch is a debt collector, Crispin said. He has a reputation in Toronto for being the kind of man hired when a creditor wants more than money returned. He has put men in the ground. He has done it with paperwork to follow. Ok. How many? Fletcher asked Beaumont. Ok. 3 I saw. Could be more I didn't, Beaumont said. They bought a map of the valley at the post. They weren't trying to hide what they were doing. Ok. They're not hiding because they don't expect resistance, Lenora said. She had come downstairs silently and was standing in the kitchen doorway in her wool coat, May against her shoulder. Her voice was level. Greer knows what we are to Greer's men. 5 women alone. He has never had reason to account for anything else. Oak. Fletcher looked at her. Oak. Then let's not disabuse them of that assumption until it's too late to be useful to them, he said. Oak. The plan was Josepha's, built on a framework Crispin refined, with logistics from Fletcher and an exit route from Reeve, who knew the land above the valley better than any map. They had the terrain. Finch's men did not. They would have to climb the lower trail in open view for the better part of 2 hours. What they would expect when they arrived was 5 frightened women and the empty cabin of men who'd gone out on the trap lines. Oak. What they got was different. Oak. They came at midday, which was either arrogance or ignorance. Fletcher wasn't sure it mattered. 3 riders and a 4th man in a wagon, which suggested they had planned to transport the women rather than walk them down the mountain. Fletcher watched them come from the tree line above the east ridge, his rifle easy in his hands, his brothers positioned at intervals across the high ground. Oak. Finch rode at the front. He was a compact man, unhurried, with the manner of someone accustomed to walking into places where he was not welcome and finding the welcome improved by the weight of authority. He dismounted in the yard with the confidence of a man who had no reason to be afraid of what was in the cabin. Oak. He knocked, which was almost polite. Oak. Lenora opened the door. Oak. She was alone, or appeared to be. She had May in her arms and a composed expression, and she stood in the doorway with the ease of a woman who had been expecting company. Oak. Mrs. Ashford, Finch said, using the false name, which told them that the agency clerk had been broken faster than Lenora had hoped. Oak. I don't know that name, Lenora said. Oak. Finch smiled. Mr. Greer's patience has reached its limit. The debt is owing, and the terms of settlement are fixed. You and your daughters will come with me today. This doesn't need to be unpleasant. Oak. No, Lenora said. It doesn't. Oak. She stepped aside. Josepha was in the doorway behind her with a loaded rifle and the expression of a woman who had considered exactly how unpleasant she was prepared for things to be. Harriet appeared at the side window, another rifle. Dora at the back. Wren at the loft above, from which Perth had, hours earlier, explained sightlines in the patient, careful voice of a man explaining something he wanted her to understand completely. Oak. Finch looked at the rifles. He looked at the women holding them. Oak. Then Fletcher's voice came from the tree line, calm as a clear morning. Those are my wives you're threatening, Mr. Finch. The rifles at the windows are my brother's wives. That makes this Brannock land and Brannock business, and you are considerably outnumbered and at a considerable disadvantage of elevation. Oak. Finch went very still. Oak. The province of Ontario has no jurisdiction in British Columbia, Crispin said, appearing from the East Ridge with Reeve behind him. Your collections mandate is not valid in this territory. You are currently trespassing on a licensed fur trapping claim in the interior, which carries its own set of legal consequences, including the right of the claim holder to defend that territory by any reasonable means. Oak. One of Finch's men reached for his gun. Oak. Reeve shot the gun out of his hand with a precision that was almost gentle in its efficiency. The man screamed and grabbed his wrist. The gun lay in the dirt. Oak. Nobody moved for a long moment. Oak. Edmund Greer, Lenora said, stepping down off the porch into the yard, May still against her shoulder, her voice carrying clearly in the cold mountain air. You can go back and tell Edmund Greer that we are no longer in his jurisdiction, legal or otherwise. And you can tell him this. Oak. She reached into her coat and produced a flat oilskin packet. She held it out so Finch could see the wax seal, the date, the name. Oak. The documents in here are copies, Lenora said, of every financial record my husband kept of his dealings with Greer. Every loan, every threat, every communication that demonstrated a pattern of coercion and extortion going back 11 years. The originals are in the possession of a solicitor in Victoria, with instructions to deliver them to the Federal Department of Justice in the event of our untimely disappearance, injury, or legal harassment. She lowered the packet. Oak. Tell Greer that the next time he sends men west, he will find his business practices in front of a federal magistrate before the mountain season ends. Oak. Finch stared at her for a long moment. He was a professional, and professionals did their own arithmetic. He looked at the rifles. He looked at the brothers on the high ground. He looked at the document packet. He recalculated. Oak. He turned his horse around. Oak. The others followed. The wagon turned in the yard with difficulty and trundled back down the trail without its intended cargo. Fletcher watched them until the tree line swallowed the last sound of hoofbeats. Then he came down from the ridge with his rifle over his shoulder and stood beside Lenora in the yard. She was trembling very slightly. He noticed and said nothing, and simply stood close enough that it would stop. Will he send more? Fletcher asked. Perhaps, Lenora said, but Greer is a man who protects his interests above all else. If we have made ourselves more expensive to pursue than to abandon, he will find other problems to occupy himself with. She looked up at the mountain, at the cold sky above the peaks. And in the meantime, a Victoria solicitor named Mr. Adler is in possession of documents that will keep him careful. 3 months later, a federal investigation opened in Toronto into Edmund Greer's financial practices, partly as the result of documents delivered to a magistrate's office in Victoria by a solicitor who had been instructed not to wait after all. Greer's lawyers tied the matter up in the courts for years, as lawyers do, but the business was exposed, the threat was neutered, and the mountains stayed quiet. The snow came early that year, which meant the Brannocks and their wives were closed into the high country together before the season they had expected, and no one complained. There was too much to do, and it turned out too much to want to do. Harriet had taken over the winter mending and expanded it into something that could charitably be called a cottage industry. Josepha was teaching a makeshift school for the settlement children 2 days a week over the telegraph at McClure. Dora had quietly reorganized the storehouse in a way that was so logical that none of the brothers could explain why they hadn't done it themselves. Wren had begun illustrating Perth's wooden figures with a small set of watercolors she'd carried all the way from Toronto, and the two of them had arrived, without discussing it, at a plan to sell them in the spring. And Lenora. Lenora had taken to sitting on the porch in the early mornings with her tea and her granddaughter May, watching the mountains in the gray pre-dawn light. Fletcher began bringing his own tea out and sitting beside her. They didn't always talk. Often they just watched the light change over the peaks, the slow fire of sunrise catching the snow above the tree line. One morning in December, Lenora said without preamble, "You are a strange man to have found at the end of a very long road." Fletcher considered this. Strange how? Kinder than your appearance suggests, she said, more patient than I expected, and not afraid of a complicated situation. Complicated is just the word simple people use for things they haven't thought through enough, Fletcher said. Lenora looked at him. Then she laughed, a real laugh, from somewhere that had been closed for a long time, and Fletcher felt it like the first thaw, after a long winter, the way the mountains smelled when the cold broke and the world remembered it knew how to be warm. On the last Sunday before Christmas, a circuit preacher came up from Kamloops on his annual rounds, a cheerful man named Reverend Boak, who was accustomed to the eccentric domestic arrangements of the mountain country, and who did not raise an eyebrow at what he found at the Brannock homestead. He conducted 5 ceremonies in the same afternoon, one after another, with the snow coming down outside the windows, and the fire high in the stone hearth, and Beaumont playing a fiddle badly, but with great enthusiasm in the corner. Dougal and Harriet stood before the Reverend with a quiet certainty that needed no witness. Crispin and Josepha argued briefly about the exact wording of the vows and then agreed, which was entirely characteristic. Reeve and Dora held hands throughout, in that straightforward, unhurried way they did most things. Perth said his vows to Wren in a voice that shook slightly, and she steadied it by squeezing his hand, and the shake went away. And Fletcher stood before Lenora with the mountain at their backs, and the fire in front of them, and the sound of his brothers' voices filling the cabin, and he thought that the arithmetic of survival was a strange and imprecise calculation, that a man could spend 14 winters accounting for everything he needed to get through the cold, and still have left entirely off the list the one thing that made the cold beside the point. He leaned down and kissed his wife, and the fiddle played badly, and outside the snow covered the mountain in a silence that was not lonely anymore. I keep thinking about the moment Lenora opened that cabin door to Mordecai Finch, her granddaughter May against her shoulder, her voice entirely level. And I wonder how many times in her life she had practiced being steady when everything underneath her was shaking. That kind of composure doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from deciding, over and over, in small moments before the large ones arrive, that you are not going to let fear make your choices for you. What struck me most about this story wasn't the standoff in the yard or the documents in the oilskin packet. It was the years before any of that, the years Lenora spent raising daughters who could hold a rifle without flinching, think clearly under pressure, and trust each other completely. That's not luck. That's the long, quiet work of building something worth protecting, and it matters more than any single act of bravery ever could. Ok. There's a straightforward kind of justice at the center of what happened to Edmund Greer. He used power as a substitute for decency for so long that he stopped being able to imagine people who had neither power nor decency to lose. And that was the gap Lenora walked right through. She didn't have money or influence or legal authority. Ok. She had her daughters, her late husband's paperwork, and the clarity of someone who had already lost the thing she was most afraid of losing and discovered she was still standing. Greer never accounted for that. Men like Greer rarely do. Ok. I think about Crispin finding Josepha's survey corrections and realizing she had already seen what he'd missed. I think about Dougal building that sewing table in the night without asking whether it would be wanted. I think about Perth lining his carvings along the windowsill for the first time, because Wren had asked him to. These weren't grand gestures. They were the small, honest acts of people learning to show up for each other. And that, more than anything, is what held the whole thing together when Finch came riding into the yard. What I take from this is something I've had to learn more than once. That the kind of character that carries you through an actual crisis is built in the ordinary days, not the dramatic ones. Lenora's intelligence was sharpest when she was calmest, and she was calmest because she had done the hard thinking long before she needed to act. Josepha's plan worked because she understood how arrogant men underestimate prepared women. Reeves' one clean shot ended a confrontation that could have killed someone, because he had spent years developing a skill with patience instead of shortcuts. And the courage in this story, the real kind, not the cinematic kind, was Lenora sitting across from Fletcher that first evening and telling him the truth after spending weeks surviving on the strength of a lie. That takes more out of a person than a standoff in a yard. It requires trusting someone you have no particular reason to trust yet. It requires believing that honesty, even when it costs you something, is still the right instrument for the moment. The mountain stayed quiet after Finch rode away. Not because the threat disappeared overnight, but because something had been built on that mountain that was harder to move than fear. I think that's the only kind of peace worth having.